Conflict arose between the United States and the Soviet Union between capitalism and communism. This is known as the Cold War. Although competition usually was through diplomacy, in many cases, the Cold War did come very close to nuclear war.
After World War II, economic growth brought prosperity and optimism. However, after the war, the brief alliance of the Soviet Union and the United States would come to an end. Conflict arose between the communist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States, changing from an isolationist country to a military superpower and leader of world affairs. The U.S. made it their goal to stop communism. This was known as the Cold War. With the Cold War, it made the United States change their priorities as foreign policy became the main focus and dominated politics. This had a huge impact on how the Americans lived. The Cold War brought many new domestic programs. This included giving more money to schools for math, science, foreign language. There was taxes on fuel, tires, and vehicles improved. Also, the national defense, and even the construction of highways as a way for people to flee. The foreign policies that arose during the Cold War was a way to increase the United States' security. They also included supporting and protecting the democracy in other countries as well as stopping the spread of communism.
Following the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union that had erupted, the United States and Soviet Union had entered an arms race, seeking to prove superiority in regards to their technology, military power, and political economic systems. The arms race included incidents that demonstrated the fight for national supremacy, such as the space race, the U-2 incident, as well as the building of highways. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 allowed the construction of 42,000 miles of interstate highways to be built. The highways would connect all major cities within the nation. In regards to the tense relationship among the Soviet Union and the United States, the highway system was meant to provide a quick evacuation plan in case of a nuclear attack on any major city. The highway system would make transportation easier and much faster. As Eisenhower was leaving office, he had warned American citizens about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address. Basically, Eisenhower was concerned that the United States was spending a large amount of money on the arms race and that would leave a negative impact on American society. His speech had left Americans to question how much money should be spent on national defense, and with that, Eisenhower's term had ended. As the strain among the United States and the Soviet Union had continued in the 1950s, a summit meeting was agreed upon to take place in Paris in 1960, along with France and Great Britain. Topics such as peace and coexistence were to be discussed until the U-2 incident just shattered those hopes. On May 1st, 1960, an American U-2 plane was shot down by the Soviets in their territory and had the pilot Gary Powers captured. Eisenhower had been using such spy planes to gather information on the nuclear weapons progress in the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union had discovered the American planes had been taking pictures from above, the Soviet Union had used new missiles to shoot down the plane. Soviet leader Khrushchev had announced the news about the U.S. infiltration, but Eisenhower had denied all accusations and claimed the plane was meant to be a spy plane. As soon as the Soviet Union had obtained proof of pictures taken from the plane, Soviet leader had demanded to end all unauthorized flights from American aircrafts over Soviet territory. The United States had refused to apologize, and the relationship between both nations had worsened. On the day of the summit meeting, the Soviet leader had walked out and withdrew his invitation for Eisenhower to visit Soviet land and gave up talks for nuclear disarmament. As for Gary Powers, he was sentenced to 10 years in jail, and the Soviet Union was released in 1962 due to an exchange that occurred between the Soviet Union and the U.S. with another Soviet spy. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the first ever satellite to be launched in Earth's atmosphere. The launch had established the very competitive space race. The space race had caused a battle between both nations fighting to achieve power and influence around the world. When the news hit that the Soviet Union had launched the first ever satellite, concerns emerged from the United States. Following the pressure set by the Soviet Union, the United States had launched their own satellite into orbit, the Explorer 1. Soon afterward, President Eisenhower had signed the order to create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or better known as NASA, to primarily dedicate their efforts on space exploration. The continuous pressure set by the Soviet Union had the United States questioning the education systems due to the lack of engineers and scientists. To solve the panic, the U.S. had established the National Defense Education Act on December 2, 1958, which had funded schools to primarily focus on subjects such as math and science. Years later, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong was the first man to land on the moon, who famously stated, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Such an achievement had made the U.S. the unofficial winners of the space race.
Election of 1960, Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, won the Republican nomination for president. Richard Nixon had gained his reputation as a statesman in his diplomatic travels to Europe and South America. He had even stood up to Nikita Khrushchev in what was known as the kitchen debate over capitalism and communism. Richard Nixon was known to be a tough campaigner. He showed that he had a strong commitment to fighting communism, and he emphasized that he had an 8-year experience as vice president. In contrast, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was barely able to win the Democrat nomination. Also for vice president, Democrats chose Texan Lyndon B. Johnson so they could get Southern votes. Their nominee, Kennedy, had grown up in a world of ease and privilege. He had come from a wealthy family and had graduated from Harvard University. Still, Kennedy had become a spokesman for personal sacrifice and progress. One of Kennedy's concerns was his public image. He was 43, which was relatively very young. To add on, he was Catholic, unlike Protestant presidents. Despite this, he stressed his character and bravery, as well as the press who shared his stories about his heroism during World War II. He also pledged a commitment to separation of the church and state.
In his inaugural address, John F. Kennedy promised to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty. He wanted to guarantee his citizens' safety and liberty as long as he was president. But before he could become president, a series of events occurred in which would affect his presidency. During the Eisenhower years, the United States lost Cuba to communism. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. The worst of this was that Castro was a communist and had a good relationship with the Soviet leader Khrushchev. When Castro first became president, the United States was waiting for the worst to happen. One of the things he did against the United States was to nationalize American businesses and ownerships in Cuba. In response, Eisenhower decided to cut off U.S. trade with Cuba. Castro then decided to get help from the Soviet Union. Now more than ever, the United States was facing a threat. Only 90 miles away from Florida was communism, the worst enemy. In March 1960, Eisenhower decided to approve the CIA plan and placed training camps in Guatemala, and where a number of anti-communist Cubans were trained to overthrow Fidel Castro. In 1961, a new president would come into place, and it was left to him to decide if to go on with what Eisenhower had started with Castro, or if to turn to a different tactic. Coming from the Democratic Party, John F. Kennedy became the new hope of the citizens of the U.S. Once in office, Kennedy decided to go on with the scheme that was being planned by the CIA. This scheme was being led by Jose Miro, who badly wanted to overthrow Castro so that he could have control of Cuba himself. The plan was to first send 14,100 men to Cuba that would land at night in a swampy area of the southern coast of Cuba, since it would be easier to hide from the enemy. They would then attack and use airstrikes to get rid of the Cuban air bases. The United Revolutionary Front would send leaders from South Florida and establish a provisional government. Before the plan could take place, on April 16, 1961, the Cuban airfield had already been bombed by 8 people that had been originally at Nicaragua. This caused the CIA to use World War II B-26 bombers that were painted as Cuban Air Force planes as a way of disguise to destroy the enemy, but Castro's military was left intact. The planes then became known, and when Kennedy heard about this, he decided to cancel the second strike. This later caused Castro to send 20,000 troops to the beach, where they would continue to have control of the sky of Cuba. President Kennedy had to do something, so he decided to send 6 American fighter planes that would defend the brigade's B-26 aircraft. But the planes arrived late due to the difference in time between Nicaragua and Cuba. This confusion caused them to get shot down by the Cubans and for many exiles to be either killed or imprisoned by Castro's army. President Kennedy refused to use U.S. forces to save the imprisoned exiles. The prisoners that were at the brigade incident were captured up to 20 months and were released once Fidel Castro and John F. Kennedy came to an agreement. The agreement consisted of Castro being given $53 million worth of baby food and medicine in exchange for the liberty of the prisoners. On December 23, 1962, after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the first plane that contained the first group of freed prisoners landed in the U.S. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a total failure for the administration of Kennedy, and he was determined to repair this at any cost.
In Cuba, Cold War tensions grew even more in the most dramatic crisis of the Cold War. On October 14th of 1962, U.S. reconnaissance planes took aerial photos of Cuba. These pictures showed clear evidence of USSR construction sites underground for launching offensive missiles that could reach the United States in a few minutes. To the USSR, this might have been a reasonable way to counter the U.S. presence of missiles present in Turkey. However, to Kennedy and most Americans, the missile sites were seen as a threat from the Soviet Union. Almost as soon as they were discovered, John F. Kennedy decided that the weapons in Cuba could not remain. Therefore, on October 22nd, he ordered a naval and air blockade. This was known as a quarantine against all offensive weapons. On October 26th, preparations were underway for an American air attack on missile sites. However, late that same evening, Kennedy received a message from Khrushchev saying that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles in Cuba if America pledged to not invade Cuba and remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Kennedy agreed despite some of the tough messages that Khrushchev had sent, and the crisis was over. Soon after, telecommunications were established so the two leaders could talk directly during a crisis. Later in 1963, the Soviet Union and U.S., along with other nations, signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to end testing of nuclear weapons. This was known as the first step to prevent a new arms race.
In 1967, first suggested by at-the-time President Lyndon B. Johnson, were agreements that contained treaties. This was called SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. During the time of Johnson, suggesting there needed to be something done involving the U.S. and the USSR weapon use, there was a Cold War between the two sides. In 1945, the Cold War broke out, and although no direct fighting was going on, there was a lot of nuclear weapons being made, and both the U.S. and USSR were in the arms race, strategizing to see who could make the better nuclear weapons. In 1967, with Johnson's suggestion, the United States and the Soviet Union talked about negotiations on the manufacturing of missiles and the carrying of nuclear weapons. These talks were called SALT. Signed in both 1972 and 1979 in Moscow and Vienna. They were intended to restrain the arms race. SALT I mainly focused on limiting the weapons. Out of this talk, there was one main treaty, the Treaty on Limitation of Anti-Ballistic Missile Systems. This regulated the use of anti-ballistic missiles that would destroy the intercontinental missiles. Out of the talk, along with the treaties, each side, the U.S. and the USSR, were limited to one launch site and 100 missiles each. The main focus of SALT I was to get the talk moving on ending the competition involving nuclear weapons. In 1979, there was a second Strategic Arms Limitation Talk, also known as SALT II. While at the first talk they limited the number of launch sites, now they wanted to limit the number of launches each side could do. But there was a problem. With limiting the amount of launches, it would result in an unequalness between the two sides, as the USSR had large missiles and the US had small missiles with greater accuracy. In total, it limited the amount of weapons to 2,400 on each side. This was signed and agreed by Jimmy Carter and Brezhnev in Vienna. Although the United States and the Soviet Union were on opposing sides involving communism and capitalism, Nixon and Brezhnev both wanted closer diplomatic relations as the Soviet Union was in many border disputes and the United States wanted help getting out of the costly Vietnam War. But although the president and leader wanted closer ties, the people would have opposing views and the tension would still continue, and if not direct, then indirect in multiple events to follow. In 1960, at the Baghdad Conference in Iraq, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries was formed, also known as OPEC. This was between Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. For the first 5 years, the organization was held in Geneva, Switzerland, and then later moved to Vienna, Austria. The main objective was to coordinate and unify policies among the main countries, and to keep a stable price and supply of petroleum. In 1973, the Arab-Israeli War was taking place. During the time of war, the United States was supplying the Israeli military with supplies and weapons. They did this out of wanting more leverage in the post-war negotiations. While the United States was supplying Israel, the Soviet Union was providing Syria and Egypt with supplies and weapons. Out of retaliation of the United States helping Israel, the Arab members in OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States by 5% each month until Israel evacuated the Arab territories. 2 months went by and they had not left. This led to a full oil embargo. While OPEC in the beginning did not intend to raise the price of oil, in the 70s they began to raise the price. Along with the embargo in 1973, they raised the oil price by 130%. This led to the United States into an energy crisis, as they depended heavily on foreign oil. Rationing and gas shortages was the new norm. This led to major lines as people wanted to fill up on gas out of fear that there would be none left. During this time, the price of gas went from 34 cents to 84 cents. As for the United States to purchase gas, it meant they would have to pay $12 a barrel compared to $3, affecting the whole economy. In an effort to relieve the pain of the issue, they asked many to conserve energy. Although the people were trying to conserve energy, things began to get more expensive and people began to get laid off of work. With the high prices of gas, many people began to buy smaller and more efficient foreign cars. This led the United States economy to fluctuate, and some even believed this event led to the start of the recession. In 1974, the embargo was lifted. The United States Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, succeeded in negotiating a military agreement with Syria and Israel. This was not the only energy crisis that the United States had faced. In the 2000s, the United States faced another energy crisis caused by what many saw to be Middle East tension and the demand from China. Also, there was a fall in the U.S. dollar. Although the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, was meant to keep stable pricing and supplying of oil, it created for some countries to have a high control over the oil that led to the oil embargo on the United States, not only creating issues at the time, but leading tensions that would carry on throughout the years.